You're listening to 360 Digital, a podcast brought to you by Mopinion's all-in-one user feedback software. This podcast series tackles a number of different topics under the digital umbrella, from best practices in UX and CRO to the latest trends and innovations in customer experience and digital marketing. This is 360 Digital. Hi everyone, my name is Erin Gilliam and welcome to another episode of 360 Digital. In our last episode, we sat down with Victor Romain, that's the Customer Success Manager at Apical. And during this chat, Victor shared some insights about how employers and companies can leverage employee experience to create lasting benefits to the organization and what marketers can really learn from this experience. So if you haven't yet given it a listen, please be sure to do so and let us know what you think. This month, however, we're hopping back over to one of our all-time favorite topics in digital. Yeah, that's right. Today, we're going to be dabbling back into the world of CRO and experimentation. Now, I say favorite because, as you might have noticed, in previous episodes on 360 Digital, we covered some other areas of CRO already. We interviewed a CRO specialist at Beerwolf, which is an online craft beer shop, to learn more about how they leverage soft data in practice to really drive their CRO strategy. We also spoke with conversion.com, where we talked about how to set up goals as well as identify how your experimentation framework should look for the best results. Both of these were really great episodes, so be sure to check those out as well. But today, we're going to take that knowledge just one step further. We're going to look at how experimentation contributes to the success of an organization. So, what are the results we can expect? What is the return on investment we get for carrying out these experiments on our digital channels? And how do we know if these experiments are effective in the first place? So for the answers to these questions, we've invited an experienced experimentation specialist on the show. It's quite a tongue twister there. This specialist has over 10 years of experience in business experimentation. He's spent a decade in corporate as a CEO of an ecommerce turnaround business, and he's the co-author of Ecommerce Website Optimization, which is a book published by Kogan Page. And currently, he's the COO of AWA Digital, which is a world-leading CRO agency that delivers growth for many e-commerce organizations across the globe. So without further ado, let's give a warm welcome to today's special guest, Johann van Tonder.
That's a good pronunciation. Very well, thanks, Erin. Thanks for having me, and well done for pronouncing my name so well.
So you do use the Dutch pronunciation.
That's right. And but I'm so used to it being pronounced in, well, should we say the anglicized way? But that was really good. Well done.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Well, thanks for taking the time out to chat with us today. So maybe you can kick things off by telling us a little bit more about yourself and, your role at AWA Digital.
Sure. So I'm based in Cape Town in South Africa. And before the pandemic, I used to travel between London and Cape Town a lot. Obviously, all of that's come to a halt. I've been locked down in Cape Town, which is not the worst place on earth to be locked down. And I was meant to be back in London now, and then Omicron happened. So here I am. And at AWA, I'm the COO, which means I'm the head of operations, and that includes the service delivery, which is really optimization. So I like to think of myself as the custodian of our methodology, our CRO methodology, experimentation methodology, and the custodian of value provided to clients. And I have a helicopter view over all the accounts and see the kind of things that go well and also the kind of things that go less well. And that's a really good place to be.
Yeah. And how long have you been working there for?
It's going on 9 years now. The agency is 10 years, just over 10 years old. And I came in fairly early. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Johann. Before we get started, we always like to break the ice with our guests a little. So we have a quick question for you. Are you ready for it?
Go for it.
Icebreaker.
All right. So I did a bit of stalking. I saw in your profile that you used to work as a lecturer in Stellenbosch, which I believe is wine country in South Africa, right?
It is wine country indeed. Yes. Yeah. I've still got one foot in the academic world. I love lecturing, and so I still do a bit of lecturing whenever I can.
Yeah, That's great. Well, it's a nice location for it. So my question is, what is your favorite South African wine, if you have one?
Yes, I do. It is hard, as with anything, to pick a favorite, and that probably changes over time. But I'd say my all-time favorite is something by Ibn Sadi called, am I going to remember it? Columbella, I think. And it's just a kind of wine that if I want to impress somebody and blow them away, then I'll put that on the table, and it's bound to get that result.
Nice. And what kind of a wine is that?
That is a red blend, and he's got another one which is a white blend called Palladius, and that's a really tough one to choose between the two. But yeah, both really good wines.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, I was there a couple of years ago, and we went to, I think it was called Del Graf Estates, and it was beautiful there.
Yeah. And there's some really good wines. And by the way, you mentioned the e-commerce turnaround business that I ran as CEO for a couple of years. That was actually a wine business. So it was an online wine retailer. So yeah, I had a bit of direct experience in the wine industry for a short few years.
Oh, wow. So you're really then a wine connoisseur.
Not really.
Oh,
There was a lot of drinking at the office. I don't know if that makes us connoisseurs, but
okay, well, great. Now we know that about you. So yeah, maybe we can kick off the podcast by you telling us really what drew you to the field of experimentation and CRO in the first place. So at first you started out in wine, and now how did you fall into this type of work?
I really stumbled into this field by accident. I was in corporate, as we said at the beginning, and I'd recently completed an MBA. And post that, I was heading up a small unit that I was given a couple of businesses that were stagnant. They'd been around for a while, but they weren't really going anywhere. And this was the early days of internet business. And there were a variety of things, e-commerce and SaaS and a few others. Some of them startup, some of them already fairly advanced in their life cycle, but all of them, my brief really was to either fix them, kill them, or sell them. And I started out by applying all the theories and frameworks, models that I'd been taught in business school. And it didn't really work. I found they were really useful to come up with plans and to do your strategic planning and to write reports that sit well with top management. But it wasn't that helpful in actually moving the needle. And I'd recently read the book 4 Steps to Epiphany by Steve Blank. It's still an all-time favorite. It's really influenced my thinking and how I work even today. And started, I think, out of desperation, just talking to customers, and to use Steve Blank's phrase, get out of the building, get the hell out of the building. The answers are not in the building, so get out. And speaking to customers as much as possible. And I asked my team to do the same. I said, instead of sitting in your cubicle, let's get in front of customers and let's really understand the world of customers and then try and improve that world. And you know what? That actually had real, tangible, visible results. And I was amazed. It was like magic. And that's how I got involved in experimentation. And really what we were doing back then was CRO, but the name didn't exist yet.
Yeah, it sounds like you're really passionate about it as well. That's great to hear.
I am. And that's why, we spoke a little bit about the lecturing. And that's why the lecturing is really appealing to me, because it's a way for me to use that passion, and to the reward that I get from teaching is firstly working with intellectual horsepower and being really stimulated by that, but then being able to sow the seeds and spread the virus of experimentation, to use a current metaphor, that's right.
Yeah, great. Well, let's get down to it then. My first question for you is, why is an experimentation program so important for organizations, and how does it really contribute to their success?
If you look at your financial statements in a year from now, or any KPI really, but let's say your financial statements, that's really the result of all the decisions you make today, tomorrow, next week, and so on. It's the more positive decisions, profitable decisions you make, the rosier that picture looks. And the more bad decisions you make, then the opposite happens as well. And that's a compound effect, right? So it's not 1 + 1 + 1, but to the power of how many ever decisions. So this is really powerful concept. And what experimentation does is it allows you to weed out the bad decisions, and you'll never get rid of them 100%. They'll still slip through, but you'll be able to make far more profitable and really good decisions. And then next year, this time, when you look in your financial statements, you're looking in the rearview mirror. It's too late to do anything. But you know, that's how it plays out. The more good decisions you made, the better it looks. And so it turns out we're actually really bad. Humans are really bad at making decisions. And if you read books like Black Box Thinking, Matthew Syed, and a few others, Think Fast and Slow, you'll get a quick sense of that. Just how many cognitive biases and shortcuts there are in the brain that actually trip us up, prevent us from making good decisions. And so experimentation is a way for us to make more good decisions than bad ones. And that, for me, is the value.
Well, it sounds like you just answered my next question. I wanted to ask, what is the ROI of experimentation? So maybe you can talk a little bit more about, beyond just the revenue impact, how it's beneficial to organizations, and maybe even more interestingly, you said like you have a lot of experience that bring up negative results and then they show like what you're doing wrong or something. So how do you kind of sell that internally and make people want to get on board with it?
Yeah, so there are really two questions. The first one is a mouthful. It's a tough question. What is the ROI of experimentation? And then secondly, how do we sell it internally? Well, let's start with the first one, the big one. What is the ROI of experimentation? I love the response to this question from Professor Stefan Tomke at Harvard Business School. He wrote a book called Experimentation Works, and anyone interested in this field should really read that. It's the result of 30 years of intense study in this field. If there's anyone on this planet who really knows about the fundamentals of experimentation, it's Professor Tomke. And his response to this question about the ROI of experimentation is to flip it around. He says, what is the ROI of not doing experimentation? And you think about that. It goes back to the previous answer, that you'll end up making more bad decisions. You really have three options. The first one is not to do anything. So not to make any decisions, not to launch any further updates to your business, no new products, no new features, no optimization. So that's the first option. The second option is to make these decisions and to launch the updates, to roll out the new products and features and changes to your site and so on without testing it. And that's where you'll make all these bad decisions that will reflect negatively in your financial statements. And then the third option is what we're talking about, is to be proactive, but test it and use experimentation as a way to weed out those bad decisions. And it's really easy to quantify the cost side of ROI, right? So, there's a cost associated with a platform, the testing platform, with a team, and so on. So it's really easy to quantify the cost side, but it's far less straightforward to quantify the upside, what you get back from it. And it's different for different people. Some organizations are more fixated on revenue. Others are more fixated on, say, learnings and insight, and that's actually a sign of a more mature organization. And then the second question about how you sell it internally, again, this varies, but I think it's a really good question. And my best response to that is the following. In your organization, if you want to sell experimentation or CRO internally, the way to do it is to apply the CRO mindset to that question. The CRO mindset is you always start with the world of your customer. You always understand your customers' wants, needs, motivations, and so on. And the same applies to your senior stakeholders. So you've got to understand their perspective and their problems and what's keeping them awake at night, and how can you help them with experimentation to move their KPIs and meet their goals. And then it becomes a different conversation. You're not just somebody standing in line asking for a share of budget. You're somebody collaborating with senior stakeholders, offering them a way to improve their world. And that's really different for every organization, but that's the best advice I can give you.
Yeah, that was great advice. All right, well, now we're going to move on to the next segment of our podcast, and that is our social media moment. During our social media moment, we like to read off an interesting tweet from another digital enterprise or digital marketer and really get your take on the matter. So, are you ready for it?
Yes.
Social media moment.
So Tracy P, that's at Lady Skis, that's the name, is an e-commerce and product marketer. She recently tweeted the quote, "Understand when testing is not appropriate. It's the effectiveness of the test, not the quantity of them." So my question is, how do organizations measure the effectiveness of their experiments in the first place?
And again, that varies. I'll give you a couple of examples of how it's done, but there's no one right answer. So one KPI that's commonly used to measure the effectiveness of experiments is something called win rate, which is the percentage of your tests that gave you a positive uplift. But there's a really dark side to that metric, because firstly, if you're doing things right, most of your experiments are likely to be negative. Maybe early on, you'll find that it's 50-50, or maybe even skews more towards positive results. But you should quickly pass that phase. If you don't, there is a risk that you're playing it safe. You're not being risky enough. So the win rate, and we see it in surveys we've done and in people we've spoken to, that's a really common one, but I'm less fond of it. I think it's the wrong metric, frankly. Another one that's often used, and it's slightly better, is to look at effect, and that's maybe, and it goes by different names, but that's the combination of win rate and impact. And impact can be determined by the number of users impacted by a test result, and the proportion to revenue that segment contributes. So that's another way to look at it. One that we are quite fond of, and it actually goes back to the tweet by Tracy P there, who spoke about effectively quantity over quality. We want to see quantity as an input metric, but not in isolation. I would agree with the tweet in that there is no point in running more tests just for the sake of running more tests. But the only way you can get more value out of a testing program is by running more tests, as long as you don't negatively affect the quality. There are one or two more that I'll mention in terms of KPIs, because I know people like KPIs, especially in this industry. One that I'm also very fond of is the percentage or the number of features not shipped. You remember I spoke at the beginning about making good decisions and weeding out the bad decisions. So that's a way to track that as a proxy, is the number of features we didn't ship. So it's a way of almost quantifying the negative results. And then one other one is time to launch. So how quickly, how fast can you move from idea to experiment? Because that's really, I think, one of the key benefits of experimentation, is that you're able to get your ideas off a piece of paper and in front of customers relatively quickly and make a decision based on that. So, we should look towards speeding up that process and and that's where the quantity then comes in. The faster you're able to do that, the more you're able to fit in, the more value you're able to create. And that's how this thing takes on a life of its own and generates, strong ROI.
Yeah, so if I understand correctly, you kind of disagree with the quote in that, you think you should still do a whole lot, like a high amount of experiments as long as the quality is good?
I don't disagree with the quote. I think it depends, but certainly what we know for a fact, and there's a lot of data around this, is that the mature experimentation programs run extremely high velocity testing programs, so high quantity. We're talking about thousands of tests at any given time. And if you look at the results of those organizations and you compare them with those who don't experiment, there's a massive gulf. So we know from the data that high velocity testing is a good thing. And there's a direct link between that and ROI. Where I agree with the tweet is if you're going to be increasing the quantity of experiments and at a quality cost, that's something you quickly want to address.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. And if you were to line up organizations that do leverage online experimentation alongside those that don't, what are the kind of results they're getting that those others are missing out on then?
Bloomberg did very interesting research on this in, I think it was 2019. And if I'm not mistaken, this is also cited in Professor Tomke's book that I mentioned earlier. And they plotted on a graph the stock price, share prices of organizations who do a lot of experimentation, have mature experimentation cultures versus those who don't. And the difference is massive. And I forget the numbers, but it is, if you look at the graph, it just hits you between the eyes that the ones who do not experiment are way behind the ones who do experiment.
And how so?
So what they did was they looked, as I say, at the share price of these companies. So they plotted two lines. One line for organizations who do a lot of experimentation, and another line for those who don't do any experimentation. And then if they graph them together, if they plot them together, you've got the line at the bottom, going really nowhere fast, which is the non-experimenting organizations. And then above that, you've got this graph that does exactly what you want a graph to be doing, which is up and to the right quite steeply. And the reason that is what we said earlier. It's because those organizations, by doing experimentation, a couple of things are happening. Firstly, they're moving fast. They're moving faster than the rest. They're able to make decisions. They're able to get their ideas out of their heads onto paper and in front of customers. They're doing this at speed. They're also making far fewer negative decisions. They're also taking far more risk. So they're being more innovative, because with experimentation, you can do that. Because you never commit to something. You don't have to play it safe. And so all these things stacked together, you get the compound benefit of all of that. And it's visible, clearly visible in this graph. There was another study done by Forrester after that, and I forget the exact numbers, but it's something like 8% difference in, I think it was top line revenue that they looked at, also comparing the two different groups of companies, experimenters versus non-experimenters. Various studies have been done that have reported the same, but the one that really stands out is the Bloomberg one.
So if I understand correctly, it's really, the speed with which they're able to optimize that gives them that extra advantage.
It's the speed with which they're able to operate. It's the level of risk which they're able to build into their operations. And it's also the level of decision making that's of a far better quality.
Okay. And so my last question for you is, your agency recently published a report called The State of Online Experimentation, which, if I'm correct, essentially highlights online experimentation practices being applied by organizations at present. And what I thought was interesting was how most of the respondents said they have a centralized experimentation team. And yeah, this was actually surprising because we're seeing that in the world of customer feedback as well. But I'm curious, what kind of impact might this have on these organizations? Like, do you have tips on how they could extend their experimentation strategy across the entire organization? So, for example, either going hybrid or just decentralizing entirely?
Yeah, as you allude to, there are three main different types of structure. The first one is centralized, then decentralized, and then something called the center of excellence, which is like a hybrid. And firstly, there's no right answer. Again, it depends on your organization. It even depends on the life cycle of your experimentation program. And often what we see is at the beginning, when you start out, then centralization is what makes sense, right? So you've got one champion somewhere in the organization, and they maybe have a small team, but they effectively driving it and they're pulling everything together. Gradually, they start involving people, colleagues from other areas in the business. And the faster that can happen and the wider it can spread, the better it is for the experimentation program. But you can't force it. It's got to happen organically. And there are ways to make this happen. And if we had another hour, we could talk a lot about that. But I believe, and it's hard, I think, to give explicit statements like this because it really depends on the scenario. But I think what works really well in experimentation is a center of excellence model, so the hybrid model. And the way I think of a center of excellence or the COE is it's like an agency within the organization. And what happens there is you've got also a central department, and they will help to enable and empower teams across the organization to run their own experiments, to use the platform. They will do training, they will advise them, but they aren't running experiments themselves. They're really the enablers. And then there'll be specialists inside of the various product teams throughout the organization. And the reason that works really well is that's how you get to the point where experimentation is democratized. In other words, everyone in the organization or the largest portion of employees in the organization are able to run experiments. Then you are moving fast, you're moving at pace, you're moving at scale, you're making decisions very quickly, and you are leaving the competitors behind you because you're effectively outpacing them.
Mm-hmm. And with that model, so if you use the hybrid model, are there certain digital tools that in quotes agency would use then to be able to share that the results of those experimentations with the wider company?
There are lots of tools, but it's an important question. The important bit is that you have the right tools, that your stack is, and this is why I said earlier, it depends on where you are in your life cycle. This is not something you'll do from day one. The things to focus on right at the beginning of experimentation program, you want to get the platforms in place. You want to get all your tooling in place so you can get data piped into it, and you can do the level of analysis you want to be able to do. You want to build up the skills to be able to do the analysis, the post-test analysis, and understand the rules around testing and so on. And one of those pieces in the tech stack is, well, two that are really important. One, obviously, is your experimentation platform. And mostly what happens is that an organization might start with something at the very beginning, start with something like Google Optimize, which is free and therefore it's low friction and you can just get it out. But then quickly move on to a paid for platform, and there are many. And then it might happen that eventually they build their own. They build their own program. This is not for everyone, but it's not uncommon for organizations with mature experimentation cultures to have that. So it's built for their unique environment. And another layer to that you absolutely need is the insights repository, because the point of testing is that you're learning something about your customer, you're learning something about their behavior and their preferences and their motivation and so on. And it's not just about getting a win. It's not even primarily about getting a win. It is primarily about learning with each test. And that's the value of even a negative test. Apart from the fact that you've stopped something from going live that shouldn't have gone live, that would have hurt the business, you're also learning something from it. And some of the biggest wins are born out of negative experiments. But you've got to have a way to document those insights. And that becomes your body of knowledge, your body of customer knowledge. And that's a really important piece of your tech stack that you have to have in place. And there are the one that's really popular at the moment is Notion, but there are many tools that can be used for that.
Okay, interesting. So yeah, before we go, we always like to give our guests a moment to share any last bits of advice they might have for our listeners. So Johann, I'll give you the floor here. Are there any takeaways you'd like to leave our audience?
Yeah, this is a really hard one to pin down. But the one piece of advice in the context of CRO that might be worth pulling out of everything that I could have said is when you look at a website or app or any digital channel, there is a temptation, and this happens in practice, that people look at it as a two-dimensional flat structure consisting of pages and the hierarchy on the page and in the flow, UI elements like your pictures and your text, copy, calls to action, and so on. And looking at it through that lens leads to a style of optimization that I characterize as moving stuff around the page. You're really shifting stuff around the page, and you'll get some results, but you'll never get really good ongoing results. It's effectively throwing stuff against the wall to see what sticks, because you're pulling often, and I see this in practice, they pull things from a list, a menu of options of things to test, and that's not a strategy. The other way to look at this digital platform, your website, your app, is as a sales conversation. So you've got potential customers on your app or on your site, and some of them are there to buy, others are there to do other things. You could understand, firstly, what are they there to do? And the ones who are prospects, the ones who are likely to buy from you, they probably have questions about your business, they have questions about your product, they have certain concerns, they may have certain anxieties about the process. And what you've got to be able to do is understand what those questions, anxieties, concerns, etc. are, and then you've got to address them. You've got to answer those questions and address those anxieties in the right place as they arise. And that's how you get really powerful results over a long period of time, where you're not testing tactically, you're not pulling things from a list, many of options. You are thinking and going about it far more strategically. And that's the secret, I think, to successful CRO.
But it really sounds like, based on what you're saying, that's why it's so customized, or so different how different organizations deal with it, because it's all can be depending on what their customers need and want.
It is really different for every organization. And I think that is a crucial point, and maybe a good one to end off with, Erin, because what often happens is that people obsess over their competitors. So they look at their competitor sites, they look at what the competitors are doing. The problem is you might be looking at a losing experiment and copying that. Who knows whether that was the best implementation? But more importantly, you're serving a different customer set. Your business is different. Your customer base is different, and you've got your own unique circumstances that you need to work according to. And we've seen this many times, that what works on one site doesn't work on another. And in fact, it's more than that. Often sites within the same company, where you have an organization with a portfolio of websites and apps, and let's say you've got 2 or 3 different fashion brands in the same group of companies, you'll find that what works on the one site doesn't work on the other. And the reason for that is it's a different customer behavior, a different customer segment. They've got different needs, different wants, and what works for the one doesn't work for the other. You've got to figure out what is How can you what is the world of your customer and how can you improve that?
Well, yeah, thanks. That's great advice. And Johann, we want to thank you again for your time and for joining us on the show today. It was great to hear your insights.
Thanks, Erin. Really good to talk to you.
Well, that's it for today's podcast. Thanks for joining, everyone. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode, and we're looking forward to bringing you much more exciting content here on 360 Digital. Thanks for listening, and be sure to tune in for a brand new episode next month.